All right, so 4 years ago, Donald Trump was on his way out, and it was possible to look at his one term in office as a fluke, as a one-off. But now he's won his party's nomination 3 consecutive times. He's clearly cemented leadership of the Republican Party, and he's even won the popular vote in this re-election campaign. Taking all that together, does Donald Trump now represent and stand in the center of what we could fairly call a new era of American history?
It's a good question whether it's a new era. I think that it's certainly something different from the past. It is a break from the Republican leaders of the past, and it is a new style of politics that I think we're still figuring out how to reckon with. The only reason I hesitate is because we don't know how it ends. We don't actually know what's been broken open. We know what's been broken, but we don't necessarily know how the story ends. At the end of the Trump's first administration, you felt like you could say, okay, I know how this story ends. And now it's kind of an open question.
I mean, I think it's fair to say that he reflects what the Republican Party is about. And the ongoing debate, if there's going to be a pivot or a turning point or a separation, is one that's harder to make after his success and entrenchment. Even though we don't know where it goes, we can see now his position is very solid. And the Republicans generally are comfortable with not just Trump, but being Trumpian. And I think that's how we need to understand this moment.
Yeah, I do think, excuse me, that Donald Trump certainly dominates our politics, but I too hesitate to say it's the beginning of an era, and in part because, I wait to see if the Republican Party nominates and elects someone who is in Donald Trump's mold and he too is successful, to really see that, this works, this type of politics works beyond Donald Trump. And I think that's important too, to try to see if this is a new era, because in a lot of ways, Donald Trump is a culmination of a lot of trends, right, that we've seen building throughout the 20th and 21st century. So it's difficult to draw those, demarcations and decide, right, new era.
What might the demarcation be? Because historians like yourselves talk about Jacksonian America, or Reconstruction, or the Progressive era, or the New Deal era, or the Cold War, or the Liberal Order, or whatever. Is there the beginning even of a name or a set of terms to describe what we're living through?
I don't have a term for it, and I also agree it's not the beginning. In fact, we are deep into this moment, and there's policy and politics. I don't know what you call it, but I think a lot of the politics he reflects in terms of immigration, in terms of a backlash toward the cultural turn of the 1960s, is deeply embedded where the GOP was with the Tea Party, where it had been in the 1980s and 90s with Newt Gingrich. We're deep in that, and those policies are pretty powerful right now for a lot of the electorate. And then there's the politics. It's a no guardrails partisanship that he totally took a deep dive into, but it works because the party's okay with it. It's hyper partisanship, no guardrails, do what you want to do, say what you want to say, and I think those two are where at least Republican politics are in this era.
Marsha, Nikki, you don't want to try to name the era? This is your chance.
Well, I do think the name will change because this is a reference to a previous era, but this is a consequence of living through the post-Cold War era. Because the Cold War era was one where democracy and freedom were the center of the conversation, where American politics was really bound by a set of consensus politics and a kind of consensus culture, right? Culture was tighter and smaller in a lot of ways. And once you take the Cold War away, politics and culture just start spinning out in a kind of political entropy, and we're living in the aftermath of that.
Something I find interesting about Donald Trump is that much of the rhetoric and the politics, how he approaches immigration, xenophobia, racism, it's all very old, right? This has been a part of the United States from the very beginning. But I do think that a lot of Americans thought we were perhaps beyond that place where you could openly, sort of state, racist and stereotypical comments about another group, and it didn't seem to matter all that much. And I think that maybe a lot of it where Americans are still trying to figure out, who we are, right, and what we're living through. And that's why it's part of the reason why I think it's difficult to name. It's like you see all this continuity, but at the same time, but I don't want to say that this is all just one amorphous mass. Because we're obviously not the same, country we were in 1800 either. So.
But you bring up a good point that some of the forces that are defining whatever this is are familiar from history. Immigration, technological change, I don't know, distrust in institutions or doubt. I mean, what are the forces that you would itemize if you needed to say, this is what's defining what we're living through?
Feels like distrust in institutions has to be near the top of that list. And when we say institutions, not just distrust in government, but distrust in courts, distrust in media. This distrust in media, I think, is actually one of the Rosetta Stones to this era, because I think we maybe didn't realize how having a cohesive shared media environment had enabled so many things that we think of as the centerpieces of democratic politics.
Yeah, I mean, we're still in the shadow of Nixon and the distrust born out of both Vietnam and then Watergate, I still think hovers over us. And I think President-elect Trump he doesn't mind that distrust. Other presidents have tried to push against it and to restore our faith. He doesn't. He goes into the distrust. He goes into division. I think it's fundamental to everything he says. And I would just kind of add, I think it is an era of reaction. I mean, if there is a word that comes to mind, he is reacting fiercely, and he embodies a reaction against the internationalism of the Cold War, the social progress of the 1960s on all the issues, immigration, race relations, and even just a reaction about the kind of Enlightenment values that were really flourishing at all these institutions that we're talking about. He represents a big no. And his first inaugural address was in some way, I will defend against all these things that are coming at it. And I don't think he's ever abandoned that message.
I'm going to come back to the first inaugural address. So the answer to the question, are we living through a new era of American history, sounds like at this point, maybe.
That's what happens when you ask historians anything.
Right.
All right. Let's talk about Donald Trump's style and his influence on the presidency itself, how the office works. Anyone want to take a swing at how Donald Trump has changed and is changing the presidency?
I mean, one thing I think about is how our political parties have become much weaker in the past few decades, and I think that Donald Trump was able to show how a single person could take advantage of that weakness and make a party sort of move and just sort of go wherever that person leads the party. And I think that's aided by a lot of dissatisfaction and distrust that Americans feel in terms of in relationship to our institutions and parties and politics, at their core. I think there's this real, a distrust and even resentment. And I think, Donald Trump has sort of presented himself as an anecdote, right? That we can break with all of that and move in a new direction. And, his celebrity helps him he's sort of above our, partisan politics in a way that's, or at least the standard ways that our politics worked.
So then is there any president or moment in a presidency that you would draw on as a comparison to Donald Trump? I mean, if you fell asleep during a prior administration and woke up and this was the president now, what era would it be for you to be like, yup, same old, same old?
Well, I mean, it wouldn't be same old, but if I was in 1974 and I was watching Watergate and I was watching debates about a president using the power of the office to go after adversaries, ignoring Congress and subverting Congress, doing whatever they wanted, Richard Nixon would be front and center. And it's different, but there is a comparison that's really important, because at the end, it's what happens when the presidency is used in a very aggressive fashion. And I think Nixon still was using the actual formal mechanisms of presidential power. What's distinct for me, about Trump is that he shows a lot of this hinges on informal norms. And if you're willing to be very aggressive in what you say and what you ignore, nothing really stops you. And so I do think there is a comparison with that Nixon era.
And there was this moment after Nixon leaves office where there was a real effort to constrain the presidency and make it smaller, make it more responsible, make it more accountable. And that worked briefly, maybe for a little while, but presidents ever since, maybe starting with Ronald Reagan, have been trying to push those boundaries back out and make the presidency bigger and bigger. And they were doing that largely within a set of received norms. And what Trump did was he blew the door off of all that and turned it into a kind of presidential power free-for-all.
And that's different. I mean, I think that is a little different than what we've seen in other presidents. Just realizing how much of leadership depends on the internal restraints, not simply the external restraints. And when you blow those away, it's often no one's going to stop you.
No one mentioned Andrew Jackson, who Trump, I think, likes to identify with as a figure from the past. He put a bust up during his first term. Maybe it was a painting. Does Andrew Jackson come to mind as a comparison in some way to Donald Trump, the way he acts, his personal style, the way he operates in the presidency?
I mean, something I think is maybe reminiscent with Andrew Jackson is that he saw himself as like the more appropriate embodiment of what the people want and who they are and their interests rather than Congress. And he sort of, had this personal connection perhaps with the electorate that he was able to use to empower the presidency. But that's still, I think, very different than what Donald Trump did in his first term in office. It's still very different. But I think there's some, sort of thematic connections that he could certainly find inspiration, right? And also the fact that he's an outsider from the, the frontier who is able to sort of shake things up is sort of how Jackson presented himself, that maybe you can connect to.
So this is a loaded question, but I'll ask it anyway. The person who sits in the Oval Office is maybe the most visible symbol of America for the world, for our fellow Americans. What does that symbol say in the Trump era? What does it communicate?
It's not ideal, but in some ways I think that it is catching up with what a lot of the world thought about the United States in like the 1990s and the 2000s when the US was becoming kind of a sole superpower and was kind of doing whatever it wanted, that exertion of raw power on the world stage. Now we're seeing that exertion of raw power domestically. And in some ways, that image that a lot of the world had of the United States in, say, the 2000s is now matching up with the man in the office.
I mean, for me, historians, and this connects to Andrew Jackson too, talk about the power of illiberalism in American political history. It's not simply about liberal values. There's a reactionary nature of our politics. There's a resistance to social change and pluralism that's deeply embedded. And I think when he is in the Oval Office, he represents that illiberalism in our century, in our times, that it's very much alive and well. And I don't think he would separate himself from that.
How do you define illiberalism in the plainest terms?
I think opposition to pluralism, belief in hierarchy and order, social hierarchy, international hierarchy, and a resistance to certain values born out of the 20th century.
Well, I was also going to add something about what does it mean, right, his presidency. And I was thinking about I teach a president's course, and I tell my students at the beginning of the semester that there are no good or bad presidents. Like, we're not here to decide who is, or maybe more specifically, who's a good or bad person. Instead, I'm interested, and I want the students to think about how this person is a reflection of who we are as a country. Like, what our institutions allow, what our parties allow, and what they also, what they elevate. Mm-hmm. And I think, Donald Trump is certainly a reflection of who we are, but also I think it's important to note that how divided our country is, right? When you look at the Electoral College or the popular vote, that he is a divisive figure, and that has to be, considered as well. right? Because not everyone agrees with him, obviously.
I'm glad you brought up ranking, because moving to this next section is all about ranking. For 25 years now, C-SPAN, with each new president, has polled and questioned historians like yourself to rank the presidents. And in this most recent ranking, Donald Trump finished in the bottom 5 all time, according to C-SPAN's survey of historians. I'm curious where you would rank him.
Bottom 5 seems right for me for one particular reason, and that is that he oversaw an insurrection against the government of the United States. He ended the tradition of peaceful transfers of power. That is an administration presidency defining act that automatically, I think, plummets you to the bottom, because it's an abandonment of one of the most important features of a democracy.
I think you're absolutely right on that being defining and different, obviously, than other presidents. That said, I don't participate in the rankings, and I love C-SPAN, but I just don't think they're that valuable, because obviously how you rank presidents will depend on your understanding of history and politics. We don't have a shared consensus. It's not clear what you're ranking. There's different elements of a presidency. And finally, it changes over time. I mean, some presidents stay, it's a short span that we've been doing this, but reputations and understandings of presidencies change as we learn more, as our politics change. So I don't participate for that reason.
Well, so Julian, you anticipate my next question, which is, you're right, we do constantly evaluate past presidents, and they have a stock almost that's rising or falling based on our present times. Would you say the stock of Donald Trump is on the rise or falling?
Well, politically, it's on the rise in that
in the view of history.
Oh, in the view. I don't know who that view is. That's the problem. I mean, we're historians, and we'll interpret it, but I still don't think it gets us anywhere. I mean, the one thing we do know is, in the view of his political impact, it's improved. That's not a good or bad. It's just he is stronger than he was a few years ago because he won re-election.
But when you think of presidents who have been part of politics at this level over more than a decade-long period, you have to go to Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, Reagan, and these are big figures. Trump, just on the numbers, would seem to be entering into that group.
Consequential, I think. That's a word I would use. I think it's a mistake to think he not only is an anomaly, but he's not having a long-term impact, both on public policy. I think he's shifted the debate on immigration. He has helped to shift it in dramatic ways. And again, in terms of his style. And I think there'll be a lot more after 4 years, and weakening international alliances, all of that. He is a consequential president. That's not a good or bad, but he does enter that canon. He's not a one-off. He's not ephemeral. We will be looking at what he has done to politics for decades, centuries to come.
Do you agree, Marsha? Oh, go ahead.
And the big difference between Trump and FDR or Reagan, you look at those electoral maps from when those presidents won, and they had huge landslide victories. And we're looking at something very different here. So I agree with what you were saying earlier, Marsha, that something has changed in the country itself. That Trump is symptomatic of, but that does set him apart from some of these other legacies.
I appreciated Nikki's clear answer, because I also avoid ranking and would initially say, you know, as you watch presidents rise and fall, I mean, it's a reflection of what we think about presidents, I think, more than, you know, and maybe as much as it is what that president actually accomplished in the office. But I mean, I think that, right, we are living in this, divisive times where we also, barely survived a pandemic. I think Americans are still trying to figure out, how to make sense of this world that we're living in, when it's, I think, what we lived through was probably unimaginable to a lot of people just a couple of years before. So, I mean, there's this sort of sense of uncertainty and chaos where I think, Donald Trump seems to President-elect Donald Trump is presenting himself as a one-man solution, right, to all of these problems, and that, of course, is not new at all. But I think, the reason that it resonates with so many people is perhaps because we are living in such uncertain times.
But you think Julian's right in saying he's consequential? This is a moment and a president, a name that we are going to be saying for decades, in thinking about the meaning of.
I think so. It's because there's so many. I think he represents extremes, right, in terms of how you can use presidential power. So the same way we look to, Richard Nixon as sort of a measure of what a president would, dare do, right? We're going to think about Donald Trump in the same way.
And it will be, I'll just add, also in terms of party politics, it'll be hard to talk at the Republican Party in this era and only see the face of Ronald Reagan or either of the Bushes. You're going to see him. And that is, part of the way in which he has become a defining feature and figure in Republican politics. So it's also the presidency, the party, and then at some level the country. We haven't talked about him being embedded in reality TV, in the news media, in social media, everything. He kind of reflects this mix amalgam we now have of all these different worlds coming together in the Oval Office. So yeah, we're going to be talking about him for a long time.
4 years ago, at this time, Donald Trump had lost an election. He was on his way out. He lost control of his party. He was being shunned by leadership, and he just lost the popular vote, so arguably he'd lost the country as well. Now, 4 years later, he's going to be standing in front of the Capitol again, the very same Capitol his supporters ransacked 4 years ago, taking the oath of office again in control of his party, and now with the popular vote, and therefore arguably the country behind him. And I think it raises the question of how January 6th, the event that everybody thought would be the defining feature, or one of them anyway, of the first Trump era or term, how January 6th will actually in fact be remembered by history. It seems obvious maybe today, but let's think about it.
We are in the middle of a contest over what January 6th means. There is the story that you just told and that I mentioned earlier of an insurrection against the U.S. government, deadly and violent, disruptive of not just the process of bringing in a new president, but also disruptive of a trend in U.S. democracy for 200 years. And there's a story that Donald Trump and his supporters have been telling about a legitimate protest in which the people who were held accountable are actually political prisoners, that nothing wrong was done on January 6th, and in fact, the election really was stolen in 2020. And I think what we are going to see is those two histories playing out in two different media environments, in two different political cultures, and they are going to, I think, continue to clash going forward in the same way that very different interpretations of the Civil War continue to live on in our textbooks, for 120 years, probably longer than that. So I think it was clear as January 6th was unwinding that the only way to come back from it was to rewrite it, and we're living through that rewriting.
I find it kind of stunning. For me, there's great clarity that entire period. It's not simply January 6th, but to have someone lose an election, a president, and try to overturn it, and it culminates in that, is historically unique and a kind of disruptive moment that was very dangerous to the democracy. And it's stunning in that now, not only is there divided memory over what happened, but there's forgotten memory about what happened. 4 years later, a lot of people aren't even talking about it. They're talking about it like it was a movie that came out rather than this major event in our democracy. And that's 4 years. They're not talking a century. And so I think this is a really kind of critical issue to get right. I don't think the historians can afford to somehow make this less than what it was.
This has become contested ground because, as Nikki had mentioned, but something I think about too is just, as someone who, I first visited the Capitol as an 8th grader, on a school trip, the idea of walking up to the Capitol and not just feeling some awe, some reverence, some, you want to like speak with, if you go inside with like hushed voices, and that you instead would walk in and break glass and, defile this space is amazing to me still. Like, I still sit and think about it, and I am shocked. And so I think about how did we get here? Like, and just sort of thinking about the, decades of sort of this like growing, anti-government sentiment and just sort of distrust of institutions and our politicians, and this sort of like growing cynicism that you would just sort of go to the Capitol and think none of this history matters and we need to take this back is still, it's so shocking to me that I think, trying to figure out how each of those individuals got to that place and were sort of swept up in that moment and thought that they, had the right to do it because the president, support was on their side, is I guess the part that I think about. Like, and I think that's part of the reason why there are Americans who are willing to like rewrite and try to reframe what happened.
There's a lot of people that day who believe that they were acting with virtue and patriotism on their side. And so the contest is over whether they were or not. And it's a really big contest at this particular moment because President-elect Trump, President Trump, has said he will pardon many, if not most, if not all, those who were convicted for taking part in the events of January 6th. And that raises the following historical question. Could those pardons age well in the eyes of history? And I ask it that way because we think of the pardons after the Civil War of Confederate officers and soldiers. You think of the pardon of Richard Nixon, controversial at the time. The Civil War pardons, controversial at the time. Jimmy Carter pardons draft dodgers, people who didn't want to sign up to fight in Vietnam. All of those pardons were highly controversial at the time, and people thought they were morally wrong and even un-American. And yet, many historians would say today that they were the right move to bring the country together and to speed the healing process. Is there a world in which a pardon for most or all of those who participated on January 6th is actually viewed favorably by history?
Well, I think that we should push back against the comparison with, say, the Civil War pardons. The Civil War pardons were handed out by a victorious president over a defeated people who had suffered that defeat and couldn't escape that defeat. Here, it's actually a little bit more like the Iran-Contra pardons, where you have a vice president who was involved in Iran-Contra, who becomes president, and then pardons his co-conspirators. And that's what the January 6th pardons would be, the pardoning of co-conspirators. I don't know that historians would look kindly on it, but how often do you think about Iran-Contra? How much does it tar the reputation of the Reagan administration? We don't think about it much at all. So I think that that's kind of the goal. It's less to have the pardons be seen as laudable and more to continue to downplay what actually happened on January 6th.
But do you think 100 years from now it's possible historians might say those pardons were the right thing to help the country move past an era of obvious violence and partisanship and polarization and self-harm?
Well, I mean, I think the basic part is the person doing the pardoning is the person who is at the center of the entire operation. And so it makes that pardon not about healing. It's possible some historians decades from now say that, but I think there'll be more people who are like the historians who look at the pardon that President Ford did of Nixon, saying it didn't actually heal the nation. We are more divided, and we became divided after that pardon, not just over Ford, but over all the issues that Watergate embodied. Didn't actually work, and I suspect that will be much the same. Will it be forgotten? That's different, and that gets back to this fast-moving kind of non-memory culture we often have, and I can imagine it just doesn't seem as significant. But I don't see a way in which you can easily come to the conclusion that this was A, about healing the country, and B, that it will have that effect.
It's hard to imagine it being forgotten, but maybe. What do you think, Marsha? It's George Washington pardoned, what was it, the Whiskey Rebellion? I don't know. There have been a lot of pardons that at the time, there were very strong voices saying this is a very bad move. And yet, in the full sweep of history, may have paved the way to a better America, or at least a calmer America.
I mean, when I think of Ford's pardon of Nixon, for example, I mean, I think about the questions. Like there's that, it's like, okay, in some way this is right, Ford and Nixon admitting that he had done something wrong, and that in some way is sort of an admission that there are limits to the presidency, and you can see that as a positive. But there's others who wonder if there hadn't been a pardon, like maybe you needed to see Richard Nixon actually go to there be trial proceedings for America to really sort of come to terms with what happened, and instead it was easier perhaps to move on because that pardon sort of ended the process of sort of making sense of what happened. So I struggle with that as well to try to figure out what this all means. But I think, like, to Nikki's point, that and Julia mentioned this too, right? That the pardon is about the person who gives the pardon. I think that will, be at the core of all of this. And if it does sort of seem to dissipate and we don't pay much attention to January 6th anymore, I would say maybe it means that a lot of Americans and maybe future might come to the conclusion that we were unwilling to face what it actually meant that Americans were willing to do this, and that a president tacitly gave permission. I think that's at the core of this as well.
It's also, just to add, it's a timing issue, meaning Ford was doing this after the scandal, and I believe, and historians don't all agree, but that he genuinely believed he could heal the country. This comes after a re-election campaign where it was about being vindictive. He was not subtle Trump, that he's going to go after enemies, he is going to isolate those who are not with him. And then you start with this. That gives it a very different flavor than a president saying, I want to heal the country. And I don't think that tenor will go away. So it's hard to see. We'll see how it unfolds, but it's hard to see it read that way.
And it's also interesting because the story is still unfolding. This is always a challenge for historians thinking about the future, which is we just don't know what happens next.
Yeah.
And if we are still kind of in the middle of an ongoing insurrection, that is going to end with more violence and more democratic backsliding, then maybe January 6th and the pardons just look like a blip on the road to that much worse outcome.
So that brings me to a closing, kind of resolving another idea that's been floating out there, which is it certainly feels to a lot of people that we're living through a particularly violent, particularly polarized and divided time. Does that feel like more than a feeling? Is it a fact? Are we living through a polarized, divided time historically?
Yes.
Yes.
I mean,
yes. This is objectively true. This is not just a.
Yeah,
there are numbers.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you can see the roll call in Congress, and you can see how few people are in the center. You can look at polls about how people feel about who their kids should marry, and the key isn't religion or even race. It's partisanship, and then you just see it in the leadership. It doesn't mean we're always acting on partisan principle. There are areas people agree, and there's politicians who can reach agreement, but we're in divided times. There's been other divided times, but this is one of them. It falls in that bucket.
Can you, we didn't want to rank the presidents, and I understand why, obviously, but would you rank the times? I mean, in terms of division and conflict within the country, we're obviously not at the Civil War. I don't even think we're at the 60s, right? I mean, we haven't been assassinations. Where are we? Where does this rank in terms of eras of division in America, of pain in America?
I think those might be two different questions, division and pain. I think we're pretty close to the 1960s in terms of the kind of shredding of the social fabric. And we're actually still fighting the battles of the 1960s over everything from voting rights to civil rights, and whether or not we're going to be an inclusive multicultural democracy. The time period I keep reaching back to is the Gilded Age, which had tightly contested elections, had growing income inequality, and had a lot of violence as the political system didn't prove capable of responding to what people needed. And whether that was violence from labor strikes or anarchists, there were assassinations of presidents, there were big third-party movements. There was all of this unrest that the system couldn't contain.
And lots of immigration and technological change.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think both are good. I do think we're closer to the 60s than people think, and I think some of the fighting takes place online instead of on the streets. It's a different way in which we express our grievances and differences, and the parties in the 60s were divided internally. Today they're not. I think, so I do think some of the heat is a little like the 60s and the intensity of divisions over issues. One difference is we're divided over everything today, meaning that partisanship now plays out on the most routine political decisions, what to do with health issues and can you pass a budget. So in some ways it feels less intense, but in some ways it's more complete today, and it's simply part of the fabric of American political culture.
How high is the flame historically?
I mean, I think hyperpartisanship has sort of warped our politics and government in immeasurable ways. But when you mentioned violence, and you think of a period, I thought about Jim Crow. I thought about the era of spectacle lynchings, where some Americans might think that was an American problem, right? A Southern problem. But the nation knew what was happening, and people, took picnic baskets and attended killings that were intended to protect a racial hierarchy, and politicians and government leaders across the nation looked away. So when I think about violence and what we're living through right now, I can think of some eras where, there's extreme examples of violence that we're not seeing in that way right now. I think in part because we have institutions that, work to make people accountable that we didn't have before. So I don't know if it's not a straightforward answer to your question, but I think it's important though to think about how, central violence has been in our history, in the experiences of many Americans when we think about what we're living through right now.
I'm glad you brought up where America was in the Jim Crow era, because I think it brings to mind the larger question of the American story and whether that story is getting better. Is the arrow of time here in America moving from a less good, more violent, less equal place with less opportunity to something over time that you can say, let me make it real simple. Can you still say that America is on a journey of progress and improvement and better days are ahead?
I wouldn't say that right now. I would say first of all that historians would never assume that things are just getting better, just going to get better, because we've seen in American history times when things got a lot worse. I mean, Jim Crow is an excellent example. There was a period of 10 to 15 years where you had true biracial governance in the US South, and that went away. It went away violently, and democracy was sort of violently put on hold for 80 to 100 years for Black Americans who had a chance to experience it during Reconstruction. And so, there's not necessarily an expectation that it will get better. I also think for historians, we're like, there's a lot of arrows. There are ways in which life is getting better, but on some pretty big metrics. When we think about democratic backsliding, when we think about violence, yes, we're not at the point where we're seeing, say, the violent, deadly attacks against immigrants, but it definitely feels like we could get there pretty quickly. We feel like a society that's barely holding on, and we can either make a choice to hold on and really shore up the ground beneath our feet, or let go. And I don't think we've made that choice yet.
And there's nothing inevitable about it. That's how I think about it. I mean, the way you move from the 1920s and 30s to today for the progress was through movement activists who risked life and limb to protest and to make the country understand that certain things were no longer acceptable and to change the law. It took presidents and legislators, politicians who heard where history needed to move and moved it that way. You know, you don't get to where we are today if Lyndon Johnson doesn't put himself behind the Civil Rights Act of '64. So to think of it as, is it cyclical or which way are we moving, kind of misses the agency of people who brought us there. And we've made progress. I mean, I do believe that, but it's fragile, it's tenuous. And if we don't uphold the progress, it can be reversed.
Which is another way of saying it matters who the president is.
Of course it matters who the president is, and yes.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. No, and I'm in agreement.
So a moment one could try to shape the course of history is certainly an inaugural address. At the very least, you can set out what your goals are as president and try to bring the country along with you. You can point in a direction and say, this is where we're going, join me. By the standards of history, what makes for a memorable and historic inaugural address?
Well, I mean, maybe one factor is, especially if the nation is in a time of crisis, if a president can meet that moment and present some optimism that Americans, buy into and feel some, excitement about those words. Like there's the potential there, for an inauguration, that address to matter. But I think, though, it's also difficult, though, to make those kind of speeches matter. And maybe more so now than ever. But I think it really it kind of depends what's happening around the president, perhaps.
I think about speeches like FDR's first inaugural or Barack Obama's first inaugural, which really were the nation is in crisis, economic crises in both of those periods. Mm-hmm. And they both came in and said, we can do this together. Right? We just had an election and people voted for different people, but we can come together and actually make this work. And that's something that I'm pledging myself to do. And that idea of sort of unity, it has become kind of like the thing that all the different presidents hit, but depending on the period you're in, it really matters. Thomas Jefferson, in his first inaugural, stands up there. It's the first time there's been a peaceful transfer of power between two opposing parties. And he says, we're all Federalists, we're all Republicans. And hitting that note, like figuring out what the thing is that's crying out to be addressed and actually addressing it in a way that moves people is the best you can hope for from an inaugural.
For me, the most powerful ones, they either touch on a basic fear that people have. So FDR talking about the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, or Abraham Lincoln in 1861 talking about the mystic chords of memory and trying to find some area of unity. They strike at optimism. JFK talking about asking not what the country can do for you, but what you can do for the country. It could inspire, and those are some of the great ones. And finally, there's a few that reshape the debate, and there's not a lot of them, but I do think of Reagan in 1981, who just reframed government as the problem in a sentence. And in many ways, that kind of was important, I think, in getting some people, to think differently about Washington. And so those are three ways in which we have some lasting inaugurals.
In Donald Trump's first inaugural address, the phrase that I think is most memorable probably is American Carnage. What did his use of that phrase tell you about how he sees history, how he sees the presidency? Or what did it tell you? What did that phrase tell you?
Well, something I find interesting about that phrase, if you look back at that speech, you read the transcript, what he says before that is a commentary on deindustrialization, right? The hollowing out of the center of our cities, these sort of how the economic so economic changes, like this much longer arc of like sort of trends and problems, dating back to the mid 20th century. And if it is sort of interesting when you look at the speech, in some ways it's not that unusual than other speeches, but I think when you think about all of the campaigning, right, and what his supporters were saying about what was wrong with America, and that he too also in his speech makes this case that the nation is in a crisis, sort of very similar to how Barack Obama says we are in a crisis. So when I look at that speech and I think about American Carnage, I think about how the criticisms that Donald Trump made of the nation, sort of beyond that speech and sort of the tenor of his campaign, that I think, sort of put more imbued that with more meaning than what you see just looking at the text.
Yeah, you look at the text of that speech, and it could be any president's inaugural address. It's all talking about unity and how we need to come together. And the reason we remember the phrase American Carnage is because of all of the information about Donald Trump and his campaign that we brought to that inauguration day. It was a campaign that was started with attacks against Mexican immigrants. It was a campaign in which he allied with the far right, the alt-right at the time, and was making sort of explicit promises to destruction and white supremacy and bringing back some very dark parts of America. And so in this speech that's kind of boilerplate, when you hear that phrase American Carnage, and I think it triggers everything people feared about that campaign, because American Carnage seemed to be what it was promising. And I think that's why that phrase stands out, even though the speech itself is presumably about unity.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's the context. The campaign of 2016 was Make America Great Again. So implicit in that is the country is not great, which is a different message than many candidates like to make. And then you have American Carnage as a title, and the section of the inaugural he's talking about whether it's deindustrialization or the problems, the social problems besetting the country, and it set the tenor. I mean, it was a very bleak way to both talk about the country and the campaign and open up your presidency. And I do think that reflects how he governs. And he uses that to then basically say, turn to me, as he said in 2024, I'm your protector. And there's a continuity there.
So then maybe this is a good closing question, because you were all clearly paying attention to Donald Trump in 2015, or if not at the time, you've gone back and thought about it. How have your perceptions of Donald Trump changed from 2015 when he began his campaign, then won the presidency, to today? If at all.
Well, the two things for me that I really learned as it unfolded, I understood he was a product of the media, but I didn't fully grasp how well he understood the dynamics of the media and how he would use the dynamics to his political advantage, how he could see in something like what was Twitter a path to shaping the national conversation. And I've kind of come to see that very well over the years. And second, I had a suspicion that he wasn't very far off from where the Republican Party was early on, and I had written about some of this. But by the end of the first term, and then even post 2020, when support still remained very strong, I came away really convinced that it was wrong to talk about Trump and the GOP. They're one and the same.
That for me too was a major realization, because Trump did seem like something outside of the Republican Party. You could certainly trace a lineage, but he just seemed an apostate on so many different subjects. And you're like, well, maybe they'll just go along with him. But what we've seen is that it's not just the Republican Party going along. It's they've embraced the politics of Donald Trump. And I think that speaks to however you want to frame it, whether it's his media savvy, his understanding of people, that there is an understanding of politics that Trump has that I don't actually think I would have credited him with in 2015, 2016. It didn't make him necessarily an effective politician. He wasn't able to do a lot of the things that he wanted to do, but through the sheer operation of power, he was able to kind of bend the Republican Party to his will, and they seemed pretty willing to bend.